Hello there. Welcome back to my channel, Lewis Too Much Analyzes Comics. In this episode, I will not be analyzing a comic because I will be analyzing the personality type of the second Robin, Jason Todd, now known as the Red Hood. Before I get into his personality, I would actually like to recommend that anybody that hasn't already go back and check out my video, Personality Typing 101. Why am I recommending that you do that? Because in that video, I am going to go into depth about all of these terms that you see listed on the board behind me. Things like extroverted intuition, introverted thinking, so on and so forth. I'm also going to talk about what the hero, the parent, the child, the inferior, so on and so forth, what all of that means. And I'm going to explain it in a lot more depth than I will in this video. In this video, I will kind of briefly summarize each of the functions. So if you do only watch this video, that's cool too. I think that you'll still kind of get an understanding. But if you want a much richer explanation of each of these functions, check out that video. All right. So that out of the way, let's get into Jason Todd's personality. So right off the bat, there's something that you'll want to hone in on. For those of you who have watched my personality typing Batman video, you may notice that Jason Todd has the exact opposite personality to Batman. Batman is an INTJ, which means that he leads with introverted intuition. His second function is extroverted thinking. His third function is introverted feeling, and his fourth function is extroverted sensing. Because I already covered Batman's personality in depth in that video, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I'm going to do like a kind of brief recap just because of the fact that it's going to explain a lot of the relationship dynamics between Jason and Bruce. So Batman leads with introverted intuition. Introverted intuition is all about picking up patterns in the environment and then trying to funnel them all in to one meta pattern. Now, introverted intuitives, what they use that meta pattern for is to determine for themselves what is the best pathway forward. And so this can make them very willful because of the fact that they have this one pathway that they're pursuing, very narrow-minded, very tunnel-visioned. They're going to pursue that goal all the way to the end. By the way, I'm an introverted intuitive, and so anytime that I talk about those kind of things, I'm talking about myself. The next function in Batman's personality is extroverted thinking, which number one is all about collecting information from others, but it's also about imposing order and structure into the world. It's also a very efficient way of thinking because it wants to essentially get to that system of order as quickly as possible, and it can sometimes miss out on certain details. Now, for INTJs, because of the fact that they're introverted intuitives, they're a lot better at picking up on certain details, which Batman will typically do, but you'll actually see even in stories like Dark Victory, where he overlooks certain details because he's so consumed with that like larger pattern that he's missing out on the little finer details. And so you'll notice that that's something that Batman actually will do a lot of times is when he's doing his detective work, he'll need Alfred or he'll need Dick Grayson to come in and like point out certain details because he's so consumed with the abstract that he's missing out on those little details. The next function for Batman is introverted feeling, which is number one, our mind's connection to our own personal emotions. Bruce, because of the fact that it's his third function, doesn't have that mature of a connection to his own emotions. They can sometimes appear to him as kind of confusing and will sneak up on him. Introverted feeling is also our connection to our own personal morality, which for Bruce is, deeply connected with the trauma that he experienced as a child. He never wants anybody to experience what he experienced, And so because of that, he dedicates his entire life, and that's based on his introverted intuition that becomes very, very tunnel visioned on that one way of doing things. He dedicates his entire life to the pursuit of what he considers justice, and what he considers justice, right, is preventing anybody from ever experiencing what he experienced as a child. His fourth function is going to be extroverted sensing, which is the body's connection to our physical senses. And high extroverted sensors tend to have really good hand-eye coordination, like really good ability to manipulate their body, gymnastics, all of that kind of good stuff. For Bruce, because it's his inferior function, it's something that he has to train and develop and constantly practice. But because of the fact that he started doing that from such an early age, and he completely dedicated his life to it, he developed his body into a weapon, into a tool that he can utilize, and so he ultimately is, has a very highly developed extroverted sensing function. And so Bruce, again, he's an introverted intuitive, he's an extroverted thinker, he's an introverted feeler, he's an extroverted sensor. Jason is his complete opposite. So he's an extroverted intuitor, he's an introverted thinker, he's an extroverted feeler, and he's an introverted sensor. Now, one of the cool things about Jason is that he is the first of the people that we've analyzed that has introverted sensing and extroverted intuition in their function stack. So I've done Batman and I've done Dick Grayson, and neither one of them had extroverted intuition or introverted sensing in their top 4 functions. And so it's going to be cool to analyze Jason because of that, because I'll get to explain how this introverted sensing function works and how extroverted intuition works. And so let's go ahead and get right to extroverted intuition. So extroverted intuition, so it's still an intuitive function, and so it's still picking up on patterns in the environment. But instead of doing what introverted intuition does, which is narrow down the patterns into one meta pattern, it's actually trying to, so you have to think of it as a puzzle, right? And so it puts all the patterns that it picks up into a puzzle. But instead of keeping the puzzle neatly together, it actually wants to spread the puzzle pieces apart and see each of the puzzle pieces as its own individual piece, and then examine it from every possible direction. And so it basically takes the puzzle piece out and says, okay, what if I turn this piece this way? What if I actually take pieces from this other puzzle over here and I combine it with this puzzle piece? What if I move this puzzle piece down here and then I move this puzzle piece over here? And so what extroverted intuition is ultimately trying to do is ask, what if of all the patterns? It wants to know, what if you change this aspect of the pattern? What if you change this aspect of the pattern? And so extroverted intuitives, number one, are idea generators because of the fact that they have all of these different what if scenarios playing out in their head. They also have, they're really good about predicting future events because of the fact that they are asking what if of all of these different possibilities. And so they develop, as they get older, because they've picked up on enough patterns, they'll develop this ability to kind of see. It's not see into the future in a magical sense. It's more just about being able to pick up patterns in the environment and utilize wisdom to notice those patterns and then project outward from the pattern, right? And so that's a function of extroverted intuition. The other thing that extroverted intuition will do is make connections because of the fact that it knows that all of this thing is a giant puzzle. It'll make connections between this puzzle piece here, all the way in the left hand bottom corner, to the puzzle piece all the way up here in the top right hand corner. And so it'll make all these seemingly random connections when in reality these things actually are connected. The thing is that the extroverted intuitive is really one of the only people that can kind of pick up on that pattern in the environment, okay? So extroverted intuitives tend to have a fairly chaotic mind because of the fact that they're living in all of these different potential realities. Versus, again, the introverted intuitives that want to narrow down reality into this one thing, right? And so right off the bat, you can see how those two things would clash between Bruce and Jason. Because the extroverted intuitive is all about all of these different what-if scenarios, and introverted intuition is all about, no, my scenario is the best scenario, right? And so you can see this in Bruce and Jason's relationship all throughout their history, right? So they're always butting heads because Bruce has his one way of doing things, and Jason is always like, yeah, but why do you have to do things that way? Why do you have to do things that way? Why do you have to do things that way? This is going to be exacerbated by the fact that Jason has introverted thinking as his parent function. So, what is introverted thinking? So, introverted thinking is a logic function. It's the mind's connection to the logic centers of the brain. And so, high introverted thinkers are very logical thinkers. Now, here's the problem with introverted thinkers that are not trained from an early age to utilize their introverted thinking for things that are more classically considered like intellectual pursuits. So things, obviously like philosophy or math, science, all of those kind of things, right? Is that introverted thinking, the way that it works is it starts with a premise and it builds from that premise all the way out to a conclusion. Now, if you enter faulty premises at the beginning, it will end up at faulty conclusions, but introverted thinkers will assume that because they're so logical, that the conclusion that they've arrived at is the correct conclusion. Now, technically, it is the correct conclusion because it's the logical outworking from the premise that was entered at the beginning. But if the premise that was entered at the beginning is a bad premise, then the logical outworking of that conclusion, of that premise, is a bad conclusion, right? And so what will happen to ENTPs that are not, that are basically are not raised in an environment where they're, taught to utilize their introverted thinking in a mature manner, is that they'll assume that they're always correct even when they're not. And so you can see how Jason and Batman, Bruce and Jason, are going to come into a lot of conflict over that. The other, now, the cool thing for Jason is, for Jason, if you've ever read his origin story, the post-crisis Jason origin story, is that Jason is raised on the streets. His dad is a criminal that gets arrested, and his mom, or at least the person that he thinks is his mom, dies very young. We'll get to what I mean by that in a little bit. So the person that he thinks is his mom dies very young, and his dad gets put in jail, as I said. And so Jason essentially raises himself on the streets. Now, what his introverted thinking is going to allow him to do is to be very street smart, because it's such a logical function. It's really good about problem solving. And so the input for Jason, right, is survive in the streets. How do I survive in the streets? He's going to use his extroverted intuition to generate all these different possibilities, and then he's going to utilize his introverted thinking to try and hone in on the most logical way to survive, and then he's going to pursue that way. Now, ultimately, he's going to try all kinds of crazy things, because extroverted intuition, it is a very chaotic function. If you know extroverted thinkers, they're very lovable, honestly. I love ENTPs and ENFPs, which are the other extroverted intuitives. I love them. I think that they're super fun, and and ultimately that's really like a really good way of describing them. They're very fun because they're constantly like generating all these different ideas in their heads, and they're making all these different connections and things like that. And so extroverted intuition can be very fun, but it can also be very chaotic, and it likes to generate chaos because of the fact that it likes to push apart the pattern, right? And so Jason is going to do a lot of things to help him survive, but he's also going to do a bunch of stupid things, which is going to lead him to try and steal the wheels off of the Batmobile, which is how Batman and Jason end up meeting, right? And so what happens is Batman sees in Jason the same thing that he saw in Dick Grayson when Dick Grayson's parents, are killed, and Batman says, "Oh, I can raise this boy and prevent him from feeling the same sort of inner turmoil that I feel." And so he, that's what he does with Dick Grayson, and even though him and Dick Grayson have their conflicts, ultimately, like, Batman actually succeeds in what he attempts to do with Dick Grayson, right? Which is provide him with a life where Dick Grayson is a much more whole human being, someone that's not obsessed with their tragedy the way that Batman is. Well, Batman thinks that he's going to do the same thing with Jason, not understanding that Jason and Dick Grayson are completely different people, partially because of their personality, actually. Jason is, again, he has a very chaotic sort of a mind, and he's, very willful in terms of his introverted thinking is going to make him think that his way of thinking is the best way of thinking. Versus Dick Grayson, that's an extroverted feeler. So he's much more of a people pleaser, and he's going to, a lot of times, kind of like submit to Bruce until he gets older. Once he gets older and he becomes a full-grown adult, and he recognizes, like, hey, man, I need to step out of this guy's shadow. I'm not going to, be taking orders from this guy for the rest of my life. Like, I'm an adult, right? But for Jason, you notice that, like, right off the bat, they have conflict because Jason is never going to submit to Bruce's way of doing things, because Jason thinks my logic function knows what it's doing. And I've already predicted out this, all of these different scenarios. I don't understand why I have to do things your way when there's all these different ways of doing things, right? And so when Batman takes Jason in, they immediately start clashing, right? Because what Jason wants to do is, as he goes out as Robin, is he starts brutalizing criminals beyond the point that's necessary. And even Batman, who, he's dedicated his whole life to essentially, like, going out into the night and beating up criminals, but he doesn't necessarily take joy in the violence. He's ultimately doing it for a purpose, right? Which is that mission that he has. And so he doesn't want to brutalize criminals beyond the point that's necessary, because he has that introverted feeling morality that was birthed in him as a child, versus Jason, that he's raised on the streets. He doesn't really have that same compulsion as Bruce does to adhere to that strict morality, because he doesn't understand, because that extroverted intuition is always asking why do I have to do this? These people are bad. Why not just go all the way and kill them? And he doesn't do that early on as Robin, but once we get to, his time as the Red Hood, we'll talk about the fact that Jason really has no compulsion, or really has no restraint as far as, or he doesn't really care whether or not he kills people. And he's always wondering why it is that Batman has this very rigid moral code. So after Batman takes Jason in, right, he and Jason are constantly having fights over this conflict between the two of them, because of the fact, again, that Jason is, like, always questioning everything that Batman does, and Batman is very determined in his way of being, right, because he has that introverted intuition that is telling him this is the way that you have to be. All right. Now, this all comes to a head in the story Death in the Family. Death in the Family reveals that Jason's mother was actually not the woman that died. Jason's mother had actually, if I'm remembering correctly, abandoned him and gone off to the Middle East to pursue kind of like a nursing career, but ultimately she's also doing a bunch of criminal activity at the same time. And so really she was just trying to enrich herself. And so Jason doesn't know any of this. He just finds out, hey, my mom is still alive. And he starts asking Bruce, like, hey, can we go and search for her? The problem is that Bruce is consumed, as he does, or as he typically gets, right? He gets consumed because the Joker has stolen nuclear warheads and is trying to sell them to the highest bidder. And so Batman is trying to stop the Joker. So he and Jason get into a fight over this, and ultimately what happens is Jason steals some resources from Bruce, and then he utilizes that to travel and start trying to track down his mom. Now, as comic books do, the kind of conveniently, the Joker happens to be selling the nuclear warheads in the same place that Jason Todd's mom is, and he actually gets involved with Jason Todd's mom because it gets connected to essentially like the deal that he's trying to make. And so Bruce and Jason end up in the same place. Now, they end up resolving things between the two of them, and Bruce ends up giving Jason his blessing to go ahead and find his mom, while Bruce goes ahead and tracks down the Joker. Now, the problem is that when Jason finds his mom, she's with the Joker, and the Joker ends up pummeling Jason to death and then blowing up the warehouse that Jason is in, and ultimately Jason dies as a result of that. And part of that is, again, because he's kind of like so consumed with the idea that his logic is correct. And I mean, I shouldn't pass too much judgment, because ultimately, like, Batman gives him his blessing, and so then Batman gets there just as Jason dies, and so Batman ends up having to carry Jason home to pack him away in a coffin and take him home. And from there, Batman pursues the Joker, and you should read the story, because ultimately I actually find the end of that story like really hilarious, because the Joker sells his nuclear warheads to like one of the leaders of one of the Middle Eastern countries, and they make him into a diplomat and then send him into the United States with diplomatic immunity so he can't be arrested. And pretty much the whole idea is that the Joker's going to blow up the United Nations. And so anyways, you should read it if you haven't already read it. Anyways, back to Jason though. So Jason spends, I think it's like 25 years, something like that, dead. But ultimately, he ends up coming back. And there's kind of conflicting narratives as to how he comes back. Ultimately, my preference is the version in Under the Red Hood, the movie, not the comic. So I actually recently read the comic, and I did really enjoy it, but I didn't like it as much as I liked the Under the Red Hood movie. The Under the Red Hood movie has a much more cohesive narrative. It's much narrower versus the comic that introduces a bunch of plot elements that are taking place in other stories at the same time, and so it kind of like drags you out of the narrative. The narrative in Under the Red Hood, the movie, is a lot more focused. Now there's one difference between the movie and the comic where I like the comic a lot better, and I'm actually going to talk about that in just a second, because of Jason's extroverted feeling child. So in Under the Red Hood, what happens is Jason comes back to life because Talia ends up getting his body and putting it in a Lazarus pit, which brings him back to life. And then she keeps him away from Batman for a while, trains him so that he develops himself into a much more capable warrior, and then sends him back to Gotham City. Now, by this point, there's a couple of things that motivate Jason. Number one, he finds out that the Joker is still alive, even though the Joker killed him. And then number two, he wants to prove to Batman that like strict moral code that Batman has is stupid, which is a very introverted thinking parent thing to do, because introverted thinking parent wants to always prove that it is right and prove that other people are wrong. ENTPs, this is why they can come off very argumentative, because they constantly want to prove that they are the ones that are right. And because of the fact that they're extroverts, they want to engage in that conflict. And that's ultimately what Jason sets out to do. Now, if you've read Under the Red Hood, you'll know that Jason is... so both of the Robins, right? So Dick Grayson is a quipper. When he goes and he fights criminals, he's a quipper. Jason, on the other hand, is not so much a quipper as he is an antagonizer. He's constantly like ridiculing his opponent. That's a very ENTP thing to do. It's something that high introverted thinkers are going to do, is ridicule you, and because they're trying to prove how much smarter they are than you and how much better they are than you. And so Jason spends that whole story kind of like antagonizing everybody that he fights against. And so in that story, what the Red Hood does is he starts attacking the mobsters, but he brutalizes them and kills them to prove that Bruce's way of resolving problems is, again, it's stupid, because he's eliminating all of these gangsters from the equation versus Bruce, that he's constantly putting them in jail, and then, ultimately they're just getting back out and causing more problems. So that's what Jason sets out to prove in that story. This, of course, brings him into conflict with Bruce, and eventually Bruce figures out that Jason is the Red Hood. That's the identity that Jason takes upon himself when he comes back from the dead. The Red Hood, by the way, was the first identity of the Joker. So before the Joker becomes the Joker, he's this criminal that puts on this red helmet and commits crimes as the Red Hood. And during an exchange with Batman, he gets thrown into that vat of acid, and that's how he ends up becoming the Joker. And so what Jason has done is actually taken on the identity of the Joker, of his own killer, which again is a very ENTP thing to do. Is kind of like harness that chaos to prove that he's better than his adversary. Okay? All right, so then at the end of that story, Bruce and Jason come into conflict over the fact that Jason doesn't understand how Bruce could have let the Joker live after the Joker killed Jason. And Batman explains to Jason that it's because if he ever violates that code that he has of never killing, he knows that he would never stop. And so he has to submit himself to that code, which ultimately that code, it was birthed when he was 8 years old, right? Because of the fact that his introverted feeling child experienced the death of his parents right in front of him, he never wants to impose death on anybody else. And he knows that if he crosses that line, then Batman essentially loses all aspirational aspects to him. He can't be an aspirational hero anymore. He'll essentially lose himself. He'll lose his tether to that introverted feeling child, and he'll essentially just live in extroverted thinking order imposition. And so he'd go crazy. Versus Jason, who has extroverted feeling child. And I know that I went on like a long tangent before I got back to the functions, but I wanted to tell Jason's story, right? So his extroverted feeling child, what does extroverted feeling do? So extroverted feeling does two things. Number one, it connects you to the emotions of the people that are around you. So it observes the emotions of the people that are around you, and it bases internal emotions off of the projection of the emotions of the people that are around you. And so typically higher extroverted feelers like Dick Grayson are going to be kind of people-pleasy because of the fact that they want everybody around them to feel good all the time, because if everybody around them feels good all the time, then they feel good all the time. The other thing that extroverted feeling does is it wants to generate harmony in the environment. So it's highly concerned with things like ethics, because it wants to make sure that things are fair for as many people as possible. Now, because it's a child function for Jason, what happens is two things. Number one, he's going to have a very naive approach to fairness. And so that's actually one of the things that he confronts Bruce with, which is, he killed me, you should kill him. And he's not taking into consideration the fact that Bruce has this very strict moral code. And we're actually going to get to Jason's introverted feeling trickster in just a second, because that's also going to play into Jason's frustration with Bruce's commitment to his moral code. So Jason questions Bruce's moral code because of the fact that he has, again, this kind of naive interpretation of what fairness is. So fairness to him is, if this was done to me, then it should be done back to him. But Bruce is kind of thinking like at a higher level, right? Which is, I can't ever take a life because ultimately then me as a symbol is completely lost. Like Batman as a symbol, Batman as a hero is destroyed. And so I can't cross that line. I stop being a hero the moment that I cross that line. Versus Jason, that he's so concerned with this idea of fairness and this kind of like naive interpretation of what's fair, that he wants Bruce to kill him. Now, this is the moment that I said I prefer in the comic than I do in the movie. So in the movie, what happens is Jason picks up the Joker. So Jason has actually kidnapped the Joker at this point in both stories. And Jason picks up the Joker and he holds a gun to his head and he tells Batman, Batman, I'm going to kill the Joker. If you don't want me to kill the Joker, you're going to have to stop me. In the movie, what Batman does is he turns around and he walks away, and he essentially does what he does at the end of Batman Begins, which I've never really liked. I love Batman Begins, but I don't like this one specific moment in Batman Begins, which is at the end when he's fighting Ra's al Ghul in the train, and he basically like blows up the back part of the train, and the train is about to crash, and Batman tells Ra's al Ghul, I'm not gonna kill you, but I don't have to save you. And then he like basically like spreads out his wings and like parachutes out of the train, and then Ra's al Ghul dies. To me, that's not what Batman is. He does basically the same thing in this Under the Red Hood movie, which is he turns around and he essentially leaves it to Jason to make the decision of whether or not he's gonna kill the Joker. And ultimately, what happens is Jason points the gun at Batman, and because Jason points the gun at Batman, and he actually fires a bullet at Batman, Batman ducks the bullet, and then he throws a batarang and like knocks the gun out of Jason's hand. In the comic, he sticks to that moral code that he has, and what he does is he pulls out a batarang and he throws it behind Jason, and then the batarang ricochets off of something behind Jason and like catches Jason it actually embeds itself in Jason's shoulder, which causes him to drop the gun, and that's how Batman ultimately saves the Joker. The reason I prefer the comic version is because Batman stays committed to that code all the way to the extreme, right? Because Batman is not going to ever allow anybody in his presence to die. Because, again, when he was 8 years old, his entire worldview was shaped by the fact that the two most important people in his life were killed right in front of him. And so even though the Joker is pure evil and and ultimately killed Jason, he's not going to allow the Joker to die in his presence. He's never going to allow anybody to die in his presence as far as he can control the situation. And so again, Jason doesn't really understand that. Now, I'm going to move on now to Jason's introverted sensing inferior and how that works, okay? So introverted sensing is, to me, it's the most, it's a very interesting function. It's the most enigmatic function to me because it's all the way at the bottom of my function stack, the same way that it is for Batman. Introverted sensing, the way that it works is introverted sensing is a connection to the physical environment, and it works similarly to extroverted sensing in that it's our mind's connection to tangible reality, to our five senses. But what it's actually doing is it's mapping experiential situations and trying to narrow down the amount of sensory experiences that the introverted sensor experiences, because what it really wants to do is kind of like highlight the best situations or the best experiences that person has had during the course of their life, and elevate those experiences to the archetypal experience, to basically like this, like, let me give you a quick example because this is going to make it a little bit easier. So let's say an introverted sensor eats a cheeseburger, and that cheeseburger tastes delicious. What they are going to want to do is go back to that same restaurant as often as possible to eat that same cheeseburger over and over and over again, because introverted sensing wants to narrow down the sensory experiences to as few highlights as possible. And so high introverted sensors, what they're going to do is build routine. And so we'll cover that when we talk about somebody that has introverted sensing higher up. Now, For Jason, his introverted sensing, the way that he utilizes it is actually through his training. So he actually is very similar to Bruce in the fact that it's not natural for him to manipulate the physical environment because intuitives really want to live up in their head, up in the realm of ideas. And you can even see that in the confrontation between Bruce and Jason, the fact that Jason is challenging Bruce's moral code. So his whole mission is essentially up in the realm of ideas. It's not really in the realm of tangible reality, right? But introverted sensing, the way that it works for Jason, is introverted sensors map experiences. So introverted sensing is part of it is the mind's connection to long-term memory. And so what will happen to introverted sensors is when they practice something repeatedly, they can master it. And so what Jason will do is essentially master his like martial arts skills, his tactical skills, all of that kind of stuff, right? Now it's a common reoccurring idea that Jason of all the Robins is actually the least physically gifted. This is because of his introverted sensing inferior. Because ultimately he has to practice versus it coming naturally to him. So Dick Grayson is actually somebody that if you watch my video on Dick Grayson, it's highlighted over and over that everything comes natural to Dick Grayson in terms of like the physical environment and all of that kind of stuff. That's because he has extroverted sensing right here. Versus Jason, he has to practice over and over and over and over and over before he gets something. Even Bruce, that has extroverted sensing inferior, everything is still going to come. He still has to dedicate himself and discipline himself, but it's still going to come easier to him than it is to Jason, who has to, again, like map those experiences over and over and over and over and over. Now, this is also going to lend to Jason's chaotic nature because introverted sensing is very routine based. And so because it's his inferior function, he doesn't do routine very good. And so I actually read this comic. It's from when DC did their Rebirth storyline. And so it was Red Hood and I think it's Red Hood and the Outlaws when he and Artemis and Bizarro all team up together. And so Jason builds himself this kind of like makeshift Red Hood cave, I guess, under police headquarters. And if you notice, he's like, it's not very organized the way that the Batcave is, right? Like the Batcave is very structured and organized. Jason's base of operations is kind of all messy. He's like eating a cheeseburger during one of the scenes, and it's kind of like dripping onto him and stuff like that. So ENTPs, because they don't really care that much about routine because of the fact that it's an inferior function, can be very messy. All right, now let's start talking about Jason's unconscious functions. And because I want to keep these videos all to around 45 minutes, I'm going to try and hurry up here, okay? So for Jason, his unconscious is actually Batman's conscious mind. And so what the unconscious is always doing is antagonizing the conscious mind, because really what you have to think about the unconscious as being is like the voices of the forgotten functions calling out from the background and saying, hey, we matter too, okay? So introverted intuition is going to be Jason's villain function, which is what it's going to do is antagonize his extroverted intuition and tell him sometimes, hey, there sometimes is only one way of doing things. You can't always live in these 50 different possibilities. And so it's going to try and narrow down the possibilities that Jason is going to have in his head. Now, the thing with the unconscious functions is that typically we're going to experience all of them fairly negatively. And so what that sounds like to him, or the reason that when Batman is trying to narrow things down for Jason to the one way of doing things, is that it sounds like Jason's villain trying to antagonize his hero. Now, just to step away from Jason for a second, the villain function is actually very beneficial to us because our hero function can sometimes get out of control and consume us, and we can kind of like live in that hero function. And the hero function, you know, it serves its purpose, but a lot of times it can be wrong. And so the villain is actually trying to help the hero by telling it like it's not always right. Now, But the problem is that the way that we experience that is through negativity, because we enjoy utilizing the hero function. And so when Jason interacts with Batman, what it sounds like to him is like his villain function talking to him, and so he it bothers him. The next function that ENTPs have is extroverted thinking. That's their critic function. So the way that the critic function works is it criticizes based on whatever that function is. If it's an extroverted function, a lot of times what it'll do is actually criticize others. And so it's going to criticize the intelligence of others, which, if you notice that Jason, he's constantly criticizing the people that are around him. That's why I was saying before that when he interacts with people that he's fighting with, he's constantly antagonizing them with his, with his words. That's partially because of his extroverted critic that's trying to do that. The other thing, though, that extroverted critic does is it criticizes Jason for not being structured enough, and then he has kind of this internal conflict for not being structured enough. And again, he's going to experience that externally through Batman telling him that he's not structured enough. And then, so now he has this voice inside him telling him that he's not structured enough. And he has this external voice telling him that he's not structured enough. And so if you're not a very mature person, you're going to resent the external voice, because it's basically mirroring that critic inside of you that's constantly telling you, you're not this enough, you're not this enough. And so if you don't like that critic inside of you, you're not going to like the external voice outside of you that's telling you that, right? Now, the thing for Jason, and I actually neglected to mention this before, is that introverted sensing also makes you very loyal. Now, for Jason, it's an inferior function, so he's going to sometimes stumble over his loyalty, but he is actually going to be very loyal, and you can actually see that there's this one comic in specific that I'll never forget, that I think it's in the New 52, it's like one of the first couple of issues in the New 52, where it like flashes back to Jason's childhood, during his time as Robin, and there's this one moment where like Bruce and Jason, they sit down on a couch, and like Jason kind of like falls asleep on Bruce, and they have this like very father-son moment. And so Jason is constantly seeking the approval of Bruce, partially because of his extroverted feeling, and also because of the fact that he's so loyal to Bruce. And you see that actually in the Rebirth story too, where Bruce kind of like brings him into the fold and starts assigning him missions again, even though Jason has killed a bunch of people and violated Bruce's one rule. Bruce brings him back into the fold. He's trying to rehabilitate him, and Jason actually adheres to Bruce's rule so that he can stay connected to Bruce, because ultimately he does want Bruce's approval, even though he has that very chaotic mind that wants to antagonize Bruce at the same time. And so that's essentially what's going to create conflict inside of a person, right? Is like you have all these different functions arguing with each other, and so Jason wants to challenge Bruce, but at the same time, he wants to be loyal to Bruce. All right, now that's going to bring us to his introverted feeling Trickster. So if you remember, what the Trickster does is it basically statics whatever that function is. So whatever function is there, it's going to generate a bunch of static in place of that function. And so because Jason has introverted feeling as his Trickster function, there's going to be two things that occur. Number one, he's not going to be very in touch with his feelings. He's not really going to know what he's feeling. The other problem that he has is he is not very in tune with his own moral structure or with his own moral values. And so that's why it's going to frustrate him so much that Bruce has this very rigid moral code, because Jason, his moral code is all confused inside of him, and he doesn't really know what exactly he believes in terms of morality, which is kind of why he actually will flip-flop a lot of the times between like being a murderer and being on Bruce's side, because he doesn't really have like a firm connection to his morality. All right, and then that's going to bring us last to extroverted sensing demon. So extroverted sensing demon. So the demon function does a couple of things. Number one, it's basically your least utilized function. Secondly, it's going to be the function that whenever you experience it, it's through a negative kind of perspective. And then third, when you go into rage mode, it essentially like activates and amplifies, and it kind of takes over you. Now for Jason, he lives in rage mode. And so what will happen is all of that mapping that he's done to his body in introverted sensing will all of a sudden emerge in extroverted sensing, and he will be so in tune with the external environment that he will actually be like a master at manipulating the external environment. He'll be a master at coordination and all that kind of stuff, but it'll be in a state of pure rage. And so ENTPs and Jason, when they're in a rage, that's actually when they're at their best in terms of fighting. Now, they can also lose control, obviously, like all people can in a rage. And so a calculating person like Batman might, sneak in and hit them with an attack that they weren't anticipating. But in that moment, in terms of manipulation of their body and in terms of manipulating their physical environment, that's when they're at their peak, when they're in rage mode. All right? And so we've gone through all of the Red Hood's 8 cognitive functions. I hope that you found this informative. And if you did, I never asked for this, but go ahead and hit the like button and I guess subscribe as well. I really appreciate all of you who watch. I love all of you. Anybody that sticks through a video this long, I have to tell you that I love you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you so much. And I will catch you in the next video.